Yeah, I didn't really know how to pitch this because it wasn't, I didn't want to give a science lesson because often that's what's expected. And I also don't have that much time, and I thought I'd just kind of take a slightly random tour through some of the current issues with respect to nuclear power. And we can pick up on anything in the question and answer session. And really what I'm looking at is a topic that's sort of on people's lips at the moment, which is nuclear power a cost-effective baseload option? You've got different competing technologies, coal, a lot of talk about shale, Mozambican gas, hydro up in the DRC, etc. And some people even question whether the term baseload is meaningful, given the fact that there's interconnectedness of renewables, which, if you have enough of them, can create theoretically a platform that renders baseload meaningless or less important. Okay, so that's roughly what I'm going to be doing. Global situation, the South African nuclear new build, the new competing technologies since the IRP 2010 was published a couple of years ago, the issue of localization, which is something that's also very important in terms of ensuring that not all of the money spent on new power plants here flows out of the country. And then comparative economics. In other words, where does nuclear fit in terms of what you would pay for other types of generating technologies? Thanks. Now, I assume that everyone's aware of the Fukushima event, and so I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but just to explain where we are as a result of the political fallout resulting from it. There's been the phase out in Germany of nuclear power, the famous Energiewende of Chancellor Merkel, moratoria in Switzerland, although there's now talk of a referendum to ask the people of Switzerland whether they want to continue with it or not. Some lifetime restrictions in Belgium. A lot of, and apart from Japan itself, most of the restrictions have happened in Europe as opposed to Asia, and I'll get into in a minute or so as to why I think that is. There have been protests in India and Japan, idling of 50 Japanese reactors. All of the operating nuclear plants globally have gone into a period of being assessed, being audited, and then having to undertake fairly expensive upgrades. This is the same for Coburg and for almost every operating power reactor in South Africa, in the world, and even research reactors such as the one at Pelindaba. There are financial challenges. For example, in Spain, the Garona reactor had to shut down because of a tax imposed by the Spanish government on nuclear operators. In other words, a tax which was a special kind of tax. The issue of securing finances for new build, bringing costs down. If we build more reactors, will the costs come down, etc. In the face of those rather negative developments since Fukushima in 2010, there are some positive developments for the industry. Countries representing over 50% of the world's population are still committed to building new nuclear plants, and there's a list of them over there in bold. And these are Argentina, Armenia, Brazil, Bulgaria, Mexico, Russia. South Africa has announced a program, but there's no procurement finalized yet. And in terms of public opinion, even some European countries, notably Britain, have fairly positive views on nuclear, particularly in the context of climate change. Let's go. What are the drivers? Why would you want to have nuclear plants in the first place? Well, climate change, for a start. The fossil fuels are the primary generators of climate change. Nuclear, if you exclude the fuel preparation, the uranium enrichment process, which, depending on what country you live in, can use fossil fuels in that enrichment process, because you need electricity, and if you're anyway burning coal to generate the electricity, the thing has a kind of a circularity about it. And so if you're using some coal-based or gas-based electricity to enrich uranium, there is some small contribution to climate change from the nuclear operations, but in a purely nuclear system, the contribution towards global warming is effectively zero. And so that, I think, was the nuclear turnaround that came post-Chernobyl, was the realization that this was the key baseload technology for meeting greenhouse gas emission targets. Energy security. In many countries, particularly countries having large, growing mega cities, and I'll give you a slide on that in a second, there have been blackouts. In such countries, it's hard, even though there may be sun in India, there may be sun in China, in very, very highly urbanized environments, it's hard to make use of it to the same extent. You need a more concentrated generating capability. You could say you could have a coal-fired power station too, but in those cities, because of the industrialization, the air quality is particularly bad. I don't know if any of you have been to Beijing recently, but you can hardly see the sun. And of course, nuclear will contribute towards reducing that. Let's go. What has been the effect of the German turnaround on the actual emissions of greenhouse gases in Germany? Well, this data is accurate up to the end of 2013, and you can see that since 1990, there's been a steady decrease of greenhouse gas emissions in Germany, down to 2009. This green band here, those are the Kyoto targets of the German government. However, what happens in 2010 is there's a steady trend upwards again. Why is that? When Germany, every week you read that Germany has hit new highs in terms of the percentage of its power which is generated by renewables. Well, the reason for that is that you need coal-fired power stations to back up the renewables, given that they're intermittent. And so, in parallel with Germany hitting these great, fantastic new records in renewables generation, they're also going back to coal. And that's what you see there. Instead of that trend going down like that, it hits a trough and then slowly starts to go up again. Of course, as you build more and more and more renewables and wind, you hope to arrest that trend. But at this stage, it looks as if they probably will get outside their Kyoto target of I think it was because you probably know better than me, a 25% reduction from 1990. They were aiming personally as a country towards a 40% reduction. They're never going to make that by 2030. Use of resources. Wind and solar power, for that matter, use huge amounts of steel and concrete. Companies like the one I work for, Avenge, love wind power because we can build lots and lots of concrete and steel structures. So one of if you compare the amount of concrete and steel for the equivalent amount of power between wind and nuclear, you use far more resources. So that's something to bear in mind when you talk about sustainability and a world where you use what's free and what's out there. It's not all free. Let's go. World's 12 largest cities in 2030. You look at them in 2010, the largest city in the world is Tokyo at about 33 million people. But in 2030, this is going to change completely. The largest city is Guangzhou, followed by Delhi. Tokyo is still there. But almost all of these cities, except for New York and Tokyo, are in what's termed the developing world. You have this phenomenon of developing world megacities. A megacity is generally defined as a city having more than 20 million people in it. And nuclear, given the atmospheric quality questions which I mentioned earlier, the space issues, is fairly well suited for environments such as that. That's why China is building more nuclear plants than any other country. That's why India is building. That's why Brazil is now considering intensifying, etc., etc. Bangladesh even, Pakistan. Let's go. This is a schematic diagram showing you how much land is required to generate the same amount of power. And I've looked at a 1600 megawatt electric power output, which is roughly the size of one of the big new so-called Generation 3 reactors that are being built in China at the moment, Finland, France, the USA, etc., and that we were thinking of procuring. For the nuclear plant, you need a 1 kilometer square radius. That's the emergency planning zone. If you want to generate the same amount of power with wind, that's what you need, 1,600 square kilometers. If you wanted to replicate the power of Coburg with wind, you would have wind turbines going all the way from Cape Town to Beaufort West, 500 meters apart. So what I'm saying here is that, and again, I'm not a type of person who'd make a pitch for a particular type of power generation. I think all forms of power generation have their place depending, and their applicability depending on the situation that you find yourself in. If you're in a highly urbanizing environment in China, nuclear makes sense. If you've got more space and you have a lot of possibility of building offshore wind, then that makes sense. Under certain circumstances, coal can also make sense. This is where the reactors in the world are currently being constructed. You can see that there are some in Europe, and Eastern Europe in particular, a few in North America, nothing in Africa at the moment, but the vast majority are here in Asia. Future plans, you see China has huge plans. They plan to build by 2030 136 nuclear reactors. Russia, India, even the USA is going up by a couple, an extra 15. So the picture today, 364 operating nuclear plants. By 2030, well, these are the plans of governments in the industry, there'll be 614. Just to summarize, what does South Africa intend to do? The plan that's currently been adopted is that 9,600 megawatts pressurized water reactors to be constructed. And the first unit by 2023, but this will probably slip to 2025 given the slowness of the decision making. This number is currently under review because that plan, the so-called IRP 2010, is being reviewed and potentially revised, so that number could change. The vendors in contention are Areva, French company, Westinghouse, which is an American company owned by Japanese, Rosatom, Russian, KEPCO, Korean, and SNPTC is China, State Nuclear Power Technology Company. There'll be a large emphasis on local content, probably a requirement of about 40%. And most of the localization will occur in construction, both civil and electromechanical, as opposed to manufacturing. The manufacturing, if the build's extended, will come later, but the sophisticated nuclear manufacturing codes, not enough companies in South Africa are currently up to scratch in that respect. And so, certainly for the first reactors, almost all of the localization will happen in construction. This is the new build profile across generating technologies. Coal, 6.3 thousand megawatts, nuclear 9.6, hydro 2.6, gas closed cycle 2.4, open cycle 3.9, there's some hydro somewhere, there's the hydro, and renewables dwarfing all of the others, 17.8. You need more renewables if you're serious about it, simply because of the availability factor. Nuclear plants on average available for over 90% of the time, renewables 25% if you're lucky. So in other words, if you're going to, if you can have 6 nuclear megawatts, that's probably matched by 18 in renewables. Now, since the IRP 2010, various gas discoveries have come onto the landscape. Are these serious or are they not serious? Let's have a look at them one by one. Let's go. You can see the huge increase in estimated recoverable East African gas reserves since 2009. It's been absolutely phenomenal. It's been this, I mean, when the IRP 2010 came out, this was then. I mean, we hadn't even heard of Mozambican gas. And suddenly, it's the biggest thing in town. Let's have another slide. Is East African gas a serious baseload option? Well, yes, it is, I think. I mean, Russian gas goes all the way to Western Europe. Now, building a pipeline up here from the Rovuma gas field down here, in terms of distance, is certainly not a big challenge. So, and of course you can liquefy it here and ship it, etc., etc. So, I think one has to definitely take Mozambique gas seriously in terms of being a source of baseload power for South Africa. Let's go. But who's going to own this value chain? In 2009, Sasol was a major player, but it's been overtaken by Anadarko, American company, ENI, Italian. The cost of developing a liquid natural gas train is between 12 and 20 billion US dollars. Now the GDP of Mozambique is about 14 billion US dollars. Of Tanzania, about 28 billion. Also energy security. Conflict returns to Mozambique after 21 years. It's not, I mean, it's related in my view to what's been discovered. You've got guys who've woken up to the fact that they also want to be in on the deal. And so probably it's not too difficult to address, because you just have to work out what they want and then negotiate. But nevertheless, it's a worry. If you have a pipeline of natural gas coming in from Mozambique to South Africa, you've got to defend that pipeline. And what you might save on building a nuclear power plant, you might spend on an air force. So until you can control the security of your energy supply, going more than 15%, in other words, your reserve margin outside your country, tends to be a bit risky. If you're in Europe, you can do it because Europe now, anyway, it wasn't stable during the Second World War, but it's relatively stable now. You can borrow from each other. But in a region which is more volatile, that becomes a bit more risky. What about shale gas? This is even in the President's State of the Nation address. He said something about shale gas. He mentioned it as a game changer. Now, anyone guess here how many wells, shale gas wells, have been drilled in the United States in the past 10 years? 250,000. So, and how many have we drilled? None. We're still at a pre-exploration phase. We're at the phase of debating whether we should explore. So, and in Europe, it's, I think, probably about between 3,000 and 5,000 wells have been drilled. So one has to separate out the United States from everywhere else. The United States has this oil and gas industry which is deployed across very wide parts of the country. There are pipelines. It's almost like a mom and pop backyard industry in places. You can pipe your oil and gas through distributed infrastructure and somebody will pay you for it. We don't have that. Similarly, there's scores of guys with licenses to drive around hazardous chemicals. There's a regulatory environment. There's nothing like that here. We're starting essentially completely from scratch. So we have a lot of it. I mean, if you look, I think we're about 7th or 8th in the world. China's got the most, and we're down here, 390 trillion cubic feet. And this is your production cost versus the number of wells. And this is in a particular basin, not overall. So, if you start off being very expensive, and only when you get to having drilled about 1,000 wells in a particular basin, do you get down to where it becomes economic. Now, there's this, at the moment, this threshold here. If it costs you more than $6 per 1,000 cubic feet to extract the shale gas doesn't pay you. And this is because at the moment gas prices around the world, because of the glut in the US, are relatively low. The estimation, and I've taken this from McKinsey, who are a great source of information, in my view, on shale gas globally. South Africa, in their estimation, you must understand we haven't done any exploration yet. But in terms of the estimated depth of where the gas is, we're sitting at about $8 in terms of the cost of extraction. So we're a bit above where it's economic to do it right now. Of course, there may be pockets of it which are more economic than other pockets, but it's, in my view anyway, a little iffy. I don't think we're going to see the benefits of this as quickly as has been predicted. I'm not saying it won't happen, but nevertheless. Now I want to say a little bit about localization and what that means in terms of a nuclear power construction. What are the aims of localization? What does it mean? It means that instead of these big foreign nuclear companies building the plants, whether they're coal plants or nuclear plants, we do it. We do a proportion of it. The most obvious reason is saving foreign currency. Okay? If you're spending 150 billion rand on a nuclear power plant, you would hope that you would be able to spend a certain proportion of it in your own country. Otherwise, all that money flows outside and Standard and Poor start flying lazy circles around you and so on. It's also in terms of instilling a quality management culture in local suppliers and increasing local high-tech capacity. The country that did this very successfully with South Korea, on the back of their creation of a local nuclear industry, came a whole lot of other high-tech developments. I mean, in 1958, South Korea had the same GDP as Ghana. What they did was they invested heavily in knowledge and in certain technologies that they kind of hand-picked. And nuclear was one of these. They, in a way, slipstreamed Westinghouse and got into a very cozy relationship with Westinghouse, which did not mind transferring technology. Other companies mind that. The Westinghouse commercial model is innovating and staying ahead of the others that you've transferred your technology to. They remain friends with you and you're always partners, but you've moved on to another area. And I guess what that does is it relies on the American science base and the culture of innovation in that country to stay there. International collaboration. Nuclear is necessarily a global industry. I mean, there's safeguards with respect to anti-terrorist measures, safety, etc. Once you go nuclear, you end up inevitably in a global conversation. You are checked by your peers. You're checked by people who've done this many times before. You have to come up to their level. And then, of course, human resource development. This happened also in Korea, in France, maybe 20 years before that, where you create this tremendously skilled engineering and science base to support what you're doing. The WP there stands for Worley Parsons, which is an originally Australian engineering company. It's got an office here in Joburg. And what they did, the Department of Trade and Industry commissioned a study on where we could localize. In other words, what could South Africans do in terms of building these plants themselves, obviously under direction of the big global nuclear vendors. Well, I'm not expecting to read all of this, but there's a big peak here on the left-hand side in construction and steel. That's what I said earlier. Almost all of the localization in the first plants will take place there. And then you've got a distributed set over here, valves, pumps, fans, all of that stuff, and cranes and so on. The difference between manufacturing in the nuclear environment and manufacturing almost anywhere else is that the amount of paper that you're involved in probably weighs more than the reactor does. You know, it's the licensing, it's the procedures. Every single screw, every nut, every column, there's paper tracking how it's been tested, who made it, when it was made, when the last inspection was, what batch it came from. That's what you've got to put in place in order to do it. And frankly, the South African manufacturing is not used to that. It's going to take a long time to get up to there. I think that's one of the areas the government's probably failed us, is in not understanding that companies are not just going to go out and do this when you don't tell them when the procurement date is. I've said this to various ministers of government. I've said, no, it's like asking us to train for the Olympics when we don't know when the date is, whether it's 2016 or 2018. That's what we have to do. And frankly, people have pulled back from it now, and the preparation in the manufacturing sector is a little bit on hold, because the boards won't let us spend the money, and they're not wrong. The other issue here, which I don't think that this thing is well understood by decision makers, is the issue of bonds and guarantees. You may have read that Eskom pulled Hitashi's bond because they were delayed and they made certain errors in Medupi. When you tender for work, you've got to put some money down so that if you mess it up, whoever you're building it for can have some way of clawing back the errors that you've made, so that they don't pay for it themselves. And generally speaking, for civil work, in other words, all of the concrete and the steel stuff, you've got to put down about 30% of what you bid for. So in other words, if you bid for something worth 100 million, you've got to put down 30 million. For electromechanical work, it tends to go even up to 100% at times. So if you were to put all of that together and say, well, okay, what will our companies have to put down as guarantees in order to get this work? Let's say, and again, this is a thumbsuck, and it's vaguely well motivated, but there's no price yet. Let's say the first 2 reactors, in other words, the first plant, cost you 150 billion rand. And you decide that, well, government said that there'll be 40% localization. 40% of 150 billion, 60 billion. Now, if you now have to, 30 plus 10 is 40. If you're now asked to put down the bonds, you need to then take 40% of 60 million rand. I've done this in dollars here because this slide was taken from a presentation I gave at an international forum. But you're ending up roughly with 24 billion rand, which are all the bonds you have to put down. Now, the market capitalization of the entire South African construction industry is about 50 billion. So the shareholders are not going to let you bet the farm on this thing. So somebody's going to have to work, either you're not going to make that 40%, and there's going to be criticism anyway if that happens. If you only localize to 20%, you're going to have people like Chris jumping up and down saying, yeah, no, they've sent all the money out the country, and the environmentalists will say the same thing. But in other words, but how do you address this? Now, the only way to address it is for government to get Eskom to lower that requirement. But of course, that's a risk. Because what happens if we do screw it up? And then we're only in for 20% as opposed to 40%. So it's a challenge. And I'm not, and this is one of the, and I think my next slide will show this. I mean, this is one of the issues of nuclear power. It's very cheap to run it, but the paying is up front. And this is where this challenge comes in. I'm just going to go into a little bit of the economics here of the different technologies. Okay, I mean, these are the project financial profiles here. I mean, if you're looking at the investment, this is over the lifetime. 50 to 60% of what you pay in the lifetime of a nuclear plant goes for paying for the plant. Operation and maintenance over 60 years of the lifetime of a plant, that's only 20 to 35%, and then the fuel is even less. Gas, on the other hand, is completely different. Cheap to buy, but all of the paying goes in the fuel. So that's why Eskom is in a hole at the moment, because Medupi is not finished on time, and during winter they've got to put on all the expensive open cycle gas plants, and so they've got a cash flow problem. So if you build gas, you're always subject to the price of gas, whereas the price of uranium is rather a much smaller factor in the overall operating costs of the lifetime of a nuclear plant. So, once you've got it, you've got it. And it's one of the best kept secrets in South Africa. I don't know why Eskom doesn't say it more often, but currently Koeberg is Eskom's cash cow. It's because they've paid it off, and it's cheap to run. So the cheapest electricity in the country comes from Koeberg. It's kind of paradoxical because it's so expensive to buy, but once you've paid it off, hey, you get it for nothing. So what's the business case for nuclear? They're twice as expensive as coal plants, but they last for 60 years as opposed to 25 to 50 years for coal. Much lower fuel cost than coal. If you wanted to replace Koeberg with a coal-fired power station, you'd be burning 10 million tons of coal a year. If you drove down to Cape Town, all you would see going past you would be trainloads of coal coming down from Mpumalanga. Or you'd bring them down by ship from Richards Bay, but you couldn't unload the coal fast enough at the port. So it's not an option for the Cape. Cape you've got, because there's no coal down there. You've got gas or you've got nuclear and renewables. The other advantage is this very high load factor. In other words, the plant delivers power all the time except when you're refueling it and doing maintenance. 20 to 30% for PV, solar and wind. But the cost of capital, that's the deciding factor. What we did in the Nuclear Industry Association is we got some clever guy from the University of Northwest who is a nuclear engineer, but he's also a financial person. And he basically did some studies for us on the so-called LCOE, levelized cost of electricity, using a weighted average cost of capital approach. And what we did was we took the full external costs of nuclear and we looked at, and we explain the terminology here, the overnight cost of a plant. That's if you pay for it now, as opposed to paying it off over time. In other words, that's the cost of the plant if you pay it off with cash today. So what we took was two overnight costs, $5.5 a watt and $7 a watt. That's a pessimistic case, and we compared it with coal with an external cost where you're paying your carbon penalties of 120 Rand a ton. And then the pessimistic case, which is the full external cost of coal, taking everything all together. In other words, paying for scrubbing, CO2 removal, sequestration, etc., etc. And what we found was that it depends very much on what you are paying for the capital that you get. So if you look at the cheaper nuclear, in other words, the $5.5 a watt, this is the levelized cost of electricity. This is rands per kilowatt hour on the left. This is the current price here is 87 cents a kilowatt hour. You hit that price, and sorry about this, it's kind of got a bit crunched here, at about 6% or so real costs for your capital. But what you find, because of the high cost, the capital cost of the plant, as your capital becomes more expensive, this completely makes nuclear not viable. So it all depends on how much the capital costs. If you can get your capital at 5-6%, it's comparable. Lower, even better. But as soon as you're going up to the 7, 8, 9, 10% or so, forget it. Now, of course, this is another way of looking at it. This is return on investment as a function of electricity selling price. What you find here is the coal, as you increase the selling price, the profitability of the coal increases faster. That's because you had to pay less for it in the first place. And so, again, the more expensive the electricity is, the more the coal starts to make sense again. This is for the negative. This is the optimistic coal case and the pessimistic nuclear case. But obviously your nominal return on the nuclear is higher because it costs more in the first place. What can I say about what you should pay for capital? Now, in the IRP 2010 and in also the IRP 2010 revised, there's a very strange number there. The number is 11% real, which essentially makes nuclear power unaffordable. When we went in and we went to the Department of Energy and we said, where does 11% come from? And they said, no, we got it from Treasury. Now, the Treasury view generally is that you should pay roughly, the cost of capital should be roughly what the government bonds cost you, which is 8% minus, subtract inflation from 8%, and that's what the government bond is. We went to the chief director in the Treasury and we said to him, well, where does this number come from? And he said to us, it comes from the director in the unit that did the work. And then we went to the director and said, where did you get this number? And the director said, no, he got it from somebody in the team who's now left. And so it was one of those things where you actually couldn't get to where it came from. And anyway, at the moment we're following up and we're looking at, well, what number should we actually use, and should all of those figures get revised? Because the energy planning units at the University of Cape Town have used that number, true, they've all used it, but no one can really explain why they're using it. So, new nuclear, if the cost of capital is right, will produce electricity more profitably than coal. You also have your plant for much longer. Your external costs are significantly lower, even in the event of an accident. I mean, you can work out how much an accident should feature in the price of your electricity by saying, well, okay, how much did Fukushima cost? High estimates are, if it cost $1 trillion, what are the chances of a Fukushima happening with a Generation 3 plant? Generation 3 plant, which is the ones that we hope to be procuring, are 100 times less likely to have an accident than Generation 2 plant is. And you can factor that in and you get something like 0.005 rands per kilowatt hour, which is what you would need to add to your price if you took that into account. The Gen 2 plants, which is what Kubik is, are roughly the same as coal, because of the different accident probability factor. So what's my view? I think that in certain regions of the country, particularly the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, you should deploy nuclear as baseload. Don't do it up here because you need large amounts of cooling water. There's at the moment, no large air-cooled nuclear plant on the market. The pebble beds could probably have done it. So what I would do would be to have a nuclear baseload down on the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape supported by wind. And up here, gas, coal is probably where the future lies. And obviously you have to add peaking technologies to deal with the cold winter days as you have at the moment. And then the other quickly deployable technologies such as open cycle gas, if there's some kind of delay in construction or some unforeseen circumstance arises. So I think that's roughly what I wanted to say. I don't know, it's kind of a slightly random walk through it.